Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Albert Samaha. I'll be the moderator for the panel. Little about me. I'm an inequality editor at BuzzFeed News, and I'm an author of Concepcion, An Immigrant Family's Fortunes. And I've personally dealt myself with the issues we'll be discussing, both as a journalist and a person. First, I want to tell you guys a little bit about the panelists that'll be joining us today. We have Arlie Hochschild, who is a professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Dean Freelon, a journalist professor at the University of North Carolina. Maria Teresa Kumar, who's the founding CEO of the Voto Latino Foundation. And Daniel Jolly, who is a psychology professor at Northumbria University in the UK. As for me, I've these folks have all kind of studied otherness and conspiracy theories and misinformation in their own capacities. I've explored it as a journalist. I think one of the frustrating things as a journalist, particularly as an investigative journalist, is you spend so much time unearthing facts, unearthing truths. It's the whole focus of our vocation, and to spend hours, weeks, days, years unearthing certain facts, only for people to see those facts and say, no, it's not credible, you're part of the deep state, we don't believe you, it's fake news, is heartbreaking in a way, and it makes you question, how do we reach people? Because we try not to, as journalists, shout into the abyss, but connect with people, connect with readers, and persuade them to believe in the information we're presenting. So this issue of misinformation is very close to my heart as a journalist, but also as a human, as I mentioned, because my mom, I've written essays about this where she is a Trump supporter and a believer in QAnon, and so she doesn't believe a lot of the things I write. She doesn't believe a lot of the things that I edit and publish on BuzzFeed. And I think one of the questions I get all the time when people hear about my mom's beliefs is they wonder how we can get along. I've heard from a lot of people who have cut themselves off from loved ones because they no longer want to argue about QAnon conspiracy theories, and it's ruined a lot of relationships. My mother and I, though, have maintained a loving, respectful relationship, in large part because we've had a lot of practice arguing about what is fact, what is not fact over the last 10 years, as more and more misinformation systems have spread around the country and around the world. And two, we've tried to not define our relationship through the lens of our disagreements, which is tough sometimes because we both find these disagreements very important. She finds that I've become a pawn of the deep state, where I find that she's been brainwashed by right-wing misinformation media entities. And those are sort of the two realities that we exist in, and the two planes where we have to operate on. And in many ways, it's a metaphor for our entire country. Because it does feel like no matter what issue is on the table today, whether it's as small as whether of whether Tom Hanks has COVID or not, or as big as whether we should get vaccinated or not, it seems every issue gets tied to one of the two poles. And when the thing that's dividing us is not so much our belief systems, but the very realities, the very information that we hold to be true, it raises a question that I hope and I'm excited to discuss with our four panelists of what can we do about it? How do we close the gap? How did this all happen? And is there any hope? I hope the answer is yes. But I'm just the moderator now, eager to chat with our panelists and hear their thoughts on this idea of where we move forward from here. So I wanted to open with a question for Dean. I know you've studied this subject at length. One thing I've always wondered is, are we seeing more misinformation now than we have in years past? Or is it sort of that there's always been misinformation and the only difference now is that it's easier to share through the internet than it was before when technology wasn't as advanced?
Sure. Great question. I do think that the internet has greatly increased opportunities for the sharing of mis and disinformation. And I do want to clarify that there is a difference between mis and disinformation. We define misinformation as the inadvertent spread of content that is manifestly false. Disinformation is where people are aware of the falsehood of the content that they spread, And they do it for malicious reasons, specifically to harm people, to advantage themselves, and in many cases, these are one and the same. And so it's interesting when you consider the mis and disinformation of the pre-internet era. And so the examples would include things like it's well known that the Russian state sources were instrumental in the sharing of the mis and disinformation that the U.S. government was responsible for the creation of the AIDS virus, right? And actually, I was just thinking about this the other day. My very first interaction with mis and disinformation as a child, this is when I was in kindergarten, not kindergarten, but elementary school, was mis and disinformation about AIDS, right? It was about how you could get it, how it spread, and all of this stuff in the form of jokes and things. We were just kids, we didn't realize what it was. But looking back on it, I realized that was my very first interaction with mis and disinformation, as a child before I was 10 years old. And so when you think about the internet age now, the speed with which it's spread, the ease with which it can be believed and understood by a large numbers of people, combined with, widespread mistrust of traditional media organizations along some political poles, it really creates the perfect storm for the spread of misinformation asymmetrically, attracting to those areas of the political spectrum that don't trust media and that are disproportionately likely to engage in bias confirming thinking, right? In this country, that's the right way, right? So I'll end there for now.
A perfect pivot to the next question that I was about to ask you, Arlie, is we think of I think many of us think of misinformation as tied to the far right. I think in large part because it played a big role in the election of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's in many ways become kind of the symbol for this era of disinformation. So I guess sort of a two-part question. One, is it in fact the case that the far right is responsible for more mis and disinformation? If so, why and how did that happen? If not, what's kind of a more realistic portrayal of the landscape?
Yes, I think probably Fox News and Now One America is responsible for more, although I think we have to think of information as having a magnet to it. And actually, so that the people that I came to study for Strangers in Their Own Land over 5 years, I left Berkeley, liberal bubble, to get to know a Tea Party, deep right Trump bubble in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And the folks I hung out with there for 5 years would watch Fox News as a friend. One woman, had a small TV right next to her computer. Another TV was in her kitchen, another in the living room. She thought of Fox and Friends as family, 5 o'clock drink family. So, and there was an eagerness. There's an emotional draw. In other words, it isn't just news, but it's news you want to hear if you're on the far right to confirm your worldview. And so there's the question of why you have the worldview, which is, I think, our subject here. Yeah.
Daniel, to that point, what sort of patterns have you seen in the folks that are susceptible to misinformation and disinformation? What do we see any patterns among them, or is this a sort of thing where everybody is sort of susceptible in their own ways?
So for me, a clear pattern in my mind is trying to understand the complex world that we all, belong in. And of course, people find conspiracy theories as well particularly appealing in times of crisis, in times of uncertainty, in times of threat. And unfortunately, to say the words COVID-19, this is a flourishing ground for those conspiracy narratives and misinformation broadly to spread, because people are trying to feel insecure and in control. They're trying to feel certain. They're trying, in essence, as well, to protect the self and their group. So by believing in a conspiracy theory that offers, arguably quite a simple solution to what is often very complex problems, that is particularly appealing. So to me, conspiracy theories exist in society as a way to kind of understand the world we belong in, as I say. But of course, they are detrimental by the fact that you believe in COVID-19 conspiracy theories. It means that you disengage with important elements of our society. So on the one hand, that makes sense because, again, if you think COVID is a hoax or something to do with Bill Gates or 5G or something in between, well, then, of course, you're going to disengage. But of course, that's based on misinformation. That's based not on fact. So for me, a pattern, therefore, is trying to understand the complex world we belong in.
And that, for the rest of us on this panel, for four of us at least, we just have to look at it, observe it, research it. Maria, you have to try to persuade people out of it. I guess so. First, when did you sort of begin to first see misinformation impacting the way people voted politically? And now that it exists, what tactics have you found? Have you found any effective tactics for persuading people out of deeply held conspiratorial beliefs they might have?
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for this conversation and for the panel. I'm learning a lot as well. I can't say that I'm a psychologist practitioner, but I'm seeing it play out in real time, Arlie. So I'm appreciative of what you're all doing. And you asked, when did we start seeing misinformation? Since we started the organization, but it was before snail mail, right? People would receive postcards or lanyards saying, don't vote, or your voting place is on Saturday and the Saturday after election, but it was mail. Or it was flyers, or it was but now imagine having the exact same thing, but posted on your Facebook page saying, don't stand in line, vote for Hillary by texting this number. And that's when we saw it come to fruition in 2016, where it was a massive operation, a paid operation. And this is where it's really important. This is not just someone in WhatsApp peddling information. This is a paid advertising campaign, recognizing then that there are real forces out there that are trying to change the rules and trying to subvert your vote. Because to do that, you have to micro-target someone. You have to know their preferences, their gender, where they live, who they might vote for. And so this is very orchestrated. And so when we saw this in 2016, frankly, by the time we saw it, it was too late. And so I'll give you an example of how we helped retrofit it and what we're doing forward. So in 2016, we had 10 celebrity voices reminding people of where to vote. In 2020, we had 267. And we trained them, and they were individuals that had as small followings as 3,000 Instagram followers in El Paso. Well, if you're 3,000, that doesn't mean anything at the national level, but at the local level, you're influencing people. And we trained them with the right information just around voting. And when we started, we had done a poll in June of last year and found that only less than 50% of Latinos were going to vote early. And we said, shoot, we have a problem, because if the past is prologue, people are going to try to hoodwink us again. And so we provided this echo chamber of information, of paid advertising, of using other people's social networks, of using even corporate communications, such as Walmart and Nike, to talk to their employees and to their customers. And we, in fact, got 83% of the people that we registered to vote early. So that means that there's interventions, that once you have the information, that you can actually go ahead and tackle it. We have now since come a long way, the same type of inoculation, so to speak, because I think we're living in a pandemic of misinformation, just that there are inoculation strategies. And so we learned that back in April of this year, we learned that roughly 27% of Latinos were on the fence when it came to the COVID vaccine. So we borrowed some of our best practices that we learned in the election and did inoculation. We identified Latino communities that had high Latino zip codes, densely populated Latinos in different zip codes, but with low vaccination rates. And we started running these ads on Google back in the middle of June and all the way through July, recognizing that basically everybody who had thought of getting a vaccine by that time would have, but there was still a significant portion of the population that was unsure. They were still in their wait and see strategy. And so borrowing some of our electoral work on how to persuade a voter to move, we applied it for vaccinations. And I have to tell you, in February of last year, we were very excited because we ran this program, and the person that saw a Voto Latino ad to go register to vote were 9 times more likely to just do just that. And we're like, wow, that's great. You have got to believe that the program that we ran with Google on inoculation for vaccines, the person that saw our ad, they were 54 times more likely to search get the COVID vaccine.
Wow.
And we did some math, and it turned out that roughly 17,000 people got the vaccine in that short period of time for less than 80 cents on the dollar. And so that tells us that if we research these constituencies, we learn what their hesitations are, and we basically flip the script, that there are interventions that we can do, but it has to be at a large scale. It can't, I mean, I'm very proud of the organization I run, but in the scheme of it, there is an effort of, hundreds of millions of dollars to keep our communities unsafe. And back to something that Daniel was saying, the reason that we're seeing this is because there's an erosion of trust in an institution. And if there's an erosion of trust in an institution and you're new to the voting system, the likelihood that you will go vote for that same person the next time around erodes. And I have to say that this COVID anti-vax movement is perhaps the most morbid form of voter suppression, because you're dealing with people's lives and at the same time giving them, closing off their lifelines to communities and to health programs and institutions that can safeguard them, and at the same time trying to get them not to continue participating in their democracy.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of issue of mistrust is what I was hoping to speak to next. And Dean, it sort of speaks to the point you made about the difference between disinformation, someone actively trying to persuade you wrong, and misinformation, just sort of the accidental happenstance of going in the wrong direction. And the COVID anti-vax movement, in many ways, feels like it may be tied to a lot of misinformation, where there are folks that have very valid reasons to mistrust the government and the rollout. And so in these cases, given the in forms where there is valid reason to mistrust the government, valid reason to mistrust institutions in this country, what role does the media have? What steps can the media take to build back trust, not just in the media, but in the other institutions that have lost trust from so many people?
Sorry, were you asking me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sure. Well, building trust in the media is a hard thing, because when you consider the kinds of individuals who fundamentally distrust the media, this is something that in many cases goes back quite a long time. So it's not something that is a recent phenomenon. And even if you look at it outside of the context of single individuals, just using the conservative, ideological side of the spectrum as an example, mistrust of the so-called mainstream media stretches back at least to the 1930s, right? If you look at Father Coughlin and a lot of the stuff that he was trying to represent insofar as being an alternative to the current mainstream media, you can draw a straight line basically, from him, all the way through to folks who were John Birchers in the 50s and 60s, on through the talk radio boom of the 70s and 80s, and on to the internet of today, which is seen by the right, I think rightly so, as an alternative information source. And so, it's a really hard question, I think, because you're really not dealing with people who are, I suppose this is true of all of us, but we have an issue wherein people are not fundamentally convinced by the strength of the evidence, right? So in other words, we're not immersed in a deliberative culture where you can just sort of show them the evidence and then they're like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to change my views now that you've shown me this convincing evidence that's going to, make me change my mind. And so I think it's, the thing that I keep coming back to when people ask me this question is, and I told my students this just the other day, I said, if I'm on the other side of the political spectrum as you, there is very little you can tell me that's going to change my mind, right? So I've already, sectioned everything you have to say off into the, realm of it's not going to convince me of anything, right? And so because of that, you have to work with people that are on their side, because those are the only people that stand a ghost of a chance of convincing them to change their minds. It's got to be somebody who's trusted, individual. So it could be somebody who's on their political side, an elite individual, right? I keep thinking about, what if Trump had really gone hard in terms of, trying to convince people to get vaccinated? I think it would have made a really big difference. The other thing that can happen is when you have loved ones who really and you can maybe testify to this a little bit yourself, Albert, but like people who really, the targets you're trying to engage with have some kind of emotional connection to. And then, they can, for lack of a better word, strong arm those individuals into nudging them into the right direction, right? So now, obviously, that can be uncomfortable, it can be difficult, but there's not a whole lot of leverage that you have. And so, so as uncomfortable as that may be, I think the people that are considering doing so have to think about the consequences of not doing so, right? The health consequences for the people that they are engaging with, the health consequences for other loved ones, children, people who can't get vaccinated of not doing this. So it's a tough choice, but we really don't have a whole lot of options that are available to us, unfortunately.
And to sort of speak to the challenge of that is early, we saw, during the election last time around that when Fox News called it Trump, a lot of Trump supporters dismissed Fox News, and now more and more people are leaving Fox News for other farther right organizations that do echo them. How do we, when even the voices that we think, and we've seen the same thing with the people like when Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio turned against Trump, suddenly those folks became enemies to them. Is there a reason we can find to not despair there? Like, how do we find voices that people who believe in misinformation, disinformation can trust when the voices they trust no longer become trusted when they oppose those information?
Yeah. I'd like to back up a minute to kind of pick up a message that Dean just made, that we're not engaged in a deliberative process. That is just so true. And in a way, if I look back at the interviews I did with these hardcore Trump enthusiasts, I see an emotional shift, a shift in emotional paradigm. So we are talking about emotions, basically. And it started, if you took a sort of journey of that emotional shift, it started with their feeling, 2015, of loss. They feel they were downwardly mobile. I think of them as the elite of the left behind, blue collar, white, feeling they're losing. And we know the psychologists are telling us loss is kind of a more powerful thing than deprivation. So they're hanging on, they're anxious. But then it drifts into stolen. So you've lost something. Ooh, why? It got taken. Taken by whom? And what got stolen? Your vote got stolen, your opportunities got stolen, your heritage. So it went from lost to stolen to focus on the thief. That would be the federal government in their worldview. And it's the object of suspicion. And then there's a distrust of everything the government does. It didn't just steal your vote, deep state, but now it's giving you misinformation or disinformation about COVID in the right-wing mind and heart. And then that distrust is kind of hooked onto we're talking about insecure, regressed people who are security seeking. And QAnon, I think, looks to them like a relief. It looks to them like a safe ground, fictive world. If you can do an empathy bridge into that world, it's we could call it crazy, but we could call it, frightened. And in it, there is a return to community because every of the other co-conspirators, you get your community back, you get your heroism back. You're a hero rescuing this beloved country. And it looks not like a problem as we see it, but as a solution. And how do we talk to those people? I think we don't give up. And I wouldn't say that the first people we talk to, I go for moderates there in sort of reach over choice, definitely. And there's a lot of really interesting work I think Maria's is part of. I think of Ian Lopez is a lean left. Fantastic work on the reaching out to the persuadables, and he's had some good luck in focusing on persuadables in crossover states. And but if we were to talk about the folks who are on the far right, I think, again, what Dean's saying, you need a credible communicator, because there are bridge builders on the other side too. And you need to get them, find them, and have them be the middleman. That's one thing to do. And the other is to talk with their symbols, to take their symbols like freedom and do what I would call a symbol stretch. You value freedom. I'm not putting that down, not saying that's unimportant, but hey, have you ever thought about being free of contaminated environment? Have you ever thought of being free of climate change? So you take their symbols, you talk through their symbols, and those are some tricks I think we need to try.
And that discussion of symbols and speaking in sort of their language and view of the world sort of reminds me that, as a species, we have a long track record of being willing to believe things on faith and not necessarily based on evidence. So Daniel, I guess the Atlantic once did a cover story comparing QAnon to a religion, and I feel like a lot of the belief systems tied to QAnon, which are, I mean, I guess they would argue not necessarily based on faith, but based on disinformation that they've gotten from sources. So I guess let me ask kind of a more conceptual question of, when you study these conspiracies, particularly things like QAnon, and the things they do for people's lives, one, do you see much, I guess, how is it, what are the differences between QAnon and the things that we consider valid religions? And to what degree is there overlap there, just in terms of why people turn to those belief systems?
So I suppose it goes back to the point I made earlier about these belief systems are used as a way to understand the world. And of course, these beliefs are, strongly endorsed. These, in essence, are someone's identity. And kind of what's been alluded to previously is that people who are drawn to, should we say, conspiracy theories and misinformation broadly as well, often feel alienated. We've showcased that people who feel socially excluded, ostracized, are more likely to find these ideas particularly appealing. So, that could be a catalyst as a way to, suddenly have a belief sort of QAnon, where arguably being a part of that new community will be quite empowering. So we know from some interviews that those who see themselves as conspiracy theorists perceive those who are now similar to them as part of a community. And of course, we know community can breed feelings of empowerment and actually can, be a real positive influence on someone. But of course, these groups arguably seem to be quite, dangerous by the fact that, we've seen many examples of people having these beliefs and then acting on them. Because of course, if you believe that the government is involved in plots and schemes, you're going to want to call them out on those plots and schemes. But of course, it's not just the government. It can be a whole range of different conspirators. So for me, it's those interlinks between, shall we say, religion and also, for example, QAnon, belief in conspiracy theories. It's the fundamental trying to understand the world, trying to explain big events as equally large big causes. Explaining, for example, climate change, which is a large event, as explained by something that's quite mundane, as in it's caused by us, with our energy we use, our footprint, something that I actively am involved in. So quite a small mundane step, really, when you think about it, doesn't necessarily meet proportionality bias, as in you expect that this big event will be explained by something equally as big. So this is a very similar kind of rhetoric and kind of bias that we have in these belief systems. So for me, yes, back to the point again, I do see them as similar, but of course, it's very dangerous in the sense that whilst we may think that actually, we're going to feel less anxious, more in control, believing in these rhetorics, in reality, that's not true. Whilst we may feel part of a community, that is true, actually, we should be even seen to actually feel more anxiety more distrust. Because of course you then think the government or whoever is involved in plots and schemes. Well, that's not going to increase your trust in the system, in the government, etc. Actually, it's probably going to erode it even further. So I always see conspiracy theories as a way that is a rational, it's a normal process that potentially we are all susceptible to, but is particularly dangerous. And tools to think about how we kind of combat and deal with some of the psychology behind those beliefs, I think are really timely.
Yeah, in some ways, it seems that there's sort of the misinformation ecosystem we've seen across the anti-vax movement is scary in a different way than the disinformation that promoted Trump, right? Because in one sense, the thing that's a bit logical about disinformation is that there is a particular player, an actor involved with a clear motive and understanding. Russian operatives want us to elect Trump in order to divide the country or something like that, where we can sort of understand that. Where with misinformation on COVID stuff, and I guess disinformation in some cases, there is not sort of a clear beneficiary from people not getting vaxxed. There's not someone that stands to gain power politically or gain a ton of wealth because a bunch of people won't get vaxxed. It's part of a conspiracy ecosystem that existed before Trump, right? That we've known about anti-vaxxers long before Trump. And so, Maria, I'm curious in terms of reaching people that believe in conspiracy theories. Do you sort of approach a person differently when it comes to persuading them to like if their belief system is rooted in this very direct, people are trying to convince you to vote for Trump, versus something much more ambiguous, like we see with COVID vaccines, where there's not a kind of direct malevolent player, but just sort of this ecosystem of beliefs. Do you take different tactics when you approach those two different?
Yeah, so I will actually push back on that. I actually think that this stuff is actually much far more coordinated than we actually give it credit for. I'll tell you that one of the anti-vax movements that came against the measles, it was shown that from the New York Times that it turned out that a lot of this disinformation that was hitting France and the United States at the same time was originating out of Russia farms. When it came up for anti-vax measles, right? So that's something that we should be aware of. Most recently, there was in London, there's a thing in the New York Times where Russian operatives were behind trying to coordinate influencers on Instagram and trying to pay them to be anti-vaccine because they were trying to be anti-Moderna, anti the Western medicines because they wanted to basically promote the Russia solution. So I would be very thoughtful in trying to think that it's disparate, because I think that it's actually part of the strategy. In fact, I think it is actually there's a destabilization that is occurring right now in disproportionately Western democratic states, because there's a lot to win if there is universal autocratic rule. And that is the cleanest way I can share it with you. I'll tell you, we did a study in the middle of April because we were trying to figure out who was most susceptible to disinformation. And we were surprised to find that, and we thought that we were going to benchmark Latinos against the white population, because usually that is where the disparity lies, because oftentimes white communities are so over-resourced with information and facts that we're like, okay, we'll use them as a benchmark. Lo and behold, what we found that it was actually white, rural, non-college educated men that did not believe in the vaccine.
I believe it.
We're number two. And what we were finding is that these white rural men were hesitant. And we saw, this was in April, we saw it play out in real time all through, right? They're the anti-vaxxers, anti-mask. It turned out that they were receiving messages of, why would you trust the government, the Joe Biden government, to give you a vaccine? They're really trying to make you unhealthy. Well, if you take about the long game, because I'm always looking at things through a political lens, the same populations were doing some sort of, the same messages were playing out in the different populations. If you're trying to get white rural voters to go out in a midterm, you have to tell them that the current government is really, really bad and really against you. So you're ginning them up around that. And at the same time, you want to get communities of color who voted in record number to not trust the new government, and so just stay home, right? So I would just be very careful and thinking that it's disparate. I don't think it is. I think that it is far and I'm just learning about all of this, right? But I think it's far more complex than we could possibly imagine, because there is a lot to gain if there's not a democracy in America, and if there's not a democracy in Brazil, and if there's not a democracy in Spain, and there's not a democracy in Philippines. And I'm sharing the places that these are hotbeds right now that we're seeing of disinformation. A lot of the disinformation, I think the challenge that happens in a lot of our communities is that they're coming from across the border, but they kind of boomerang back and forth between borders, but it's all going through WhatsApp. And what we're seeing, an entry point is not through QAnon, like that, they end up there, but they start with health and wellness. They start with very, almost how do you heal after this difficult time? And the next thing we know, you're in a QAnon chat room, right? So I would just be careful, because there's billions of dollars being thrown into this, and someone has to be paying for it. It's just not so organic as we'd like, I think, as they like us to believe.
Very important point. And quick follow up on that. Does that understanding play a role in kind of the persuasion? Like, are people receptive to, once they find out, oh, here are the possible actors behind the information you're getting?
We're learning. I'm perhaps one of your other panelists, but we're learning. I can share with you, I went through a very personal moment. You talked about your mother. I went through a very personal moment. My mother is in the healthcare industry. She takes care of the elderly, and she was hesitant to take the vaccine. It took me about 7 weeks to get her to tell me why. And it turned out that she had been receiving bad information from a friend of hers at the gym. And then I started walking through her. I said, Mommy, you always had, I still call her Mommy. Mommy, you are in the healthcare industry. You gave me all my vaccines. You've taken all your vaccines. Who doesn't want to keep you healthy? And the moment I said that, she all of a sudden, things opened up, and she's like, you're right. Who would not want me to be healthy? Right. And so it was a process. And I think back to what Albert, you were saying, and Daniel, you were saying, and Dean, we actually have to create this, these environments of love to bring people back, because they are being played with their lives in many, at the most extreme. And in others, it's finding them in almost, it's the equivalent of cults, but it's mostly online. And it's scary, because what we saw on January 6th was a translation of QAnon in a very real physical environment that potentially could have been an attempted coup. So.
Can I follow up just really briefly on the question of profit motive and all of this? I think Maria did a great job of covering the political aspect, but I want everybody to think about the sort of political economy of this. In other words, the profit motives that kind of drive this. Like, we live in an attention economy, right? And so it's a basic axiom of an attention economy that if you have a group of people that are already predisposed to distrust the government, distrust the media, that's a situation that's just waiting for an unscrupulous entrepreneur, or more than one, to enter into that situation and monetize it. So you think about it in terms of, a One America News trying to get their ratings up, right? Newsmax trying to get their ratings up, right? Like even traditional Fox News, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, all these folks, they're all trying to get their ratings up. Why? So they can get their advertising, rates up. And so I think a lot of what you see is some of it is ideological, some of it is nationalistic. You're talking about cross-border mis and disinformation. A lot of it is just driven by money. People don't care about what's really going on, what's really real. They're just saying whatever they have to say to be able to make money. It's ad-driven. A lot of what you see also on the health side is the sale of alternative, medicines that have no medical, merit. As an alternative to getting vaccinated, which is free or cheap in many cases. And so that, I think, is the flip side to the political aspect of this, which is very powerful. But there are a lot of people who don't care about politics and only care about money and really don't care what they have to say to be able to get that.
Great. And I have a few more questions, but also just want to open it up. I invite any of you in the audience to please send in your questions, and then we'll get to them as they come in. In the meantime, while we wait on some of the questions to come in from the audience, Arlie, I'm curious. When you embarked on your research, what was there anything that surprised you in terms of the mindset of a lot of the sources you were speaking with, and why they believe what they believe?
Everything surprised me. I thought I was in a foreign country, and I wasn't just going to a different place and a bunch of Tea Party people, and I thought initially that's what I was doing, but had entered a different truth.
Yep.
And it had its own fabric. And yeah, and those same people after January 6th are part of the third of Americans that now believe that, the election was stolen and distrust the government and other things it does. So they are, and actually they've doubled down. They've gotten more anxious. Their big hero is out of the picture now, and that has made them more insecure, and they're tougher than when I met them. And others, it's like after January 6th, I saw a split. Some people went into the 5 stages of grief. Oh man, I was had, and others doubled down into QAnon, and it was a bifurcated thing. And a lot of people are actually turning off their sources of information to just kind of recover, but that puts them in the private company of people who affirm their extreme beliefs. I think there is a way out of this, and it's really vital. I just want to add that I think we're talking about something extremely important. Everyone I talk to expects more trouble. And I think part of the purpose of bridging is preventive, and part of it is reconnaissance, and part of it is pre-steps for potential crossovers, putting a sidewalk down. But the part that's preventive, I think we should remember that study that was done in the 1960s. It came out of the Kennedy School to look at the difference between cities that blew up violently at racial riots in the 60s. And some cities it happened to, and some cities that had exactly the same characteristics, it didn't happen to. And so the researchers asked, hey, what's the difference? The difference wasn't the number of cross-racial friendships. It wasn't at the personal level. It was one level up from that. That one minister had just had coffee or gone to a conference with another minister, black and white and left, right. And, or clubs, the Lions Club, but the local leaders had built connective tissue so that when trouble knocked on the door, you could get on the phone and say, hey, here's what my people are saying, how about yours? And I think we actually, just looking ahead at what we might be heading into, could see a very pragmatic preventive function to crossover, which to a lot of people, this empathy thing seems too soft. Maybe you're, giving up your own moral soul just to identify with another person. I don't think so. We really, I think there are such important reasons to do this work.
And I'd like to pivot that question over to you, Daniel. We just talked about how there are malevolent forces who will continue to push disinformation on people for their own gain. What have you seen that pulls people out of disinformation rabbit holes? Is there a particular sort of formula? Does it differ for each person? How do people get out of this?
I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it's difficult. Really difficult, and it's not something that can happen overnight. A good example there, over 7 weeks talking through and trying to understand the concepts. For me, I see people in different kind of camps in a way. You've got people who are quite skeptical, who are asking questions, rightly so, but who are going to be inoculated against misinformation, as in giving people the facts. They would listen, and I have data that showcases that this actually works with conspiracy theories too. But we've then got another camp where we have people who are enrooted in that rhetoric. They have these beliefs hardened, which are much more challenging to engage with. Because of course, if you go in and give them facts, they're going to believe that you're part of the conspiracy and push back on that particular point. So I think some of the points that you mentioned so far are useful for those types of people, as in it's about communication. It's about building that shared space between you and your loved one, your friend, your family, whoever it is. You know, I mentioned about changing and showcasing, I can't remember the wording now, it was really good wording, symbols, changing the symbols. One idea we have is based around critical thinking. So, of course, if you ask someone who believes in conspiracy theories, are you a critical thinker? They will say, yes, of course I am. But data showcases that whilst they believe they are, objectively they are not. As in, they ask the questions, but they stay in their echo chambers. They look at the first hits on Google, for example, something that we're all guilty of doing. So potentially when you engage in conversations, it's highlighting that you both, have the values of critical thinking. But instead you talk about the skill sets that are involved in that. So think about how you navigate the online world, how you navigate Google, for example, and that this shared space could be a way to talk through the rhetorics in that way. So as in, you're not going to debunk or to say they're wrong, you're right, but rather it's more of a supportive conversation. And indeed, it's not been mentioned so far, but of course, conspiracy beliefs and misinformation are also happening in our children, happening in the sense that these beliefs are flourishing in younger populations. In some work that I've been involved in recently, we demonstrated that, at least in the UK, age 14 seems to be a flourishing ground for conspiracy theory beliefs to emerge. Now, we need to understand a bit more why. Unfortunately, my research to date, and no one else's so far, has been able to uncover why. But around age 14, middle adolescence, is when people young people rely less on emotional regulation. So we've been shown that this less reliance is actually associated with increased anxiety, which we know is predictor of belief in conspiracies. Similarly, during the emotional development, people are relying more on their friends rather than their family. And of course, at least legally, it's when they're allowed to get social media, so TikTok, Twitter. So it could be a very kind of flourishing ground for these things to emerge. But of course, at least from my view, it's not telling students or young people, how to think, but rather it's giving them the skill sets to ask questions and then to evaluate. So as in the skill sets around digital literacy, I think are really important. At least in the UK, which is what I can talk to, unfortunately, I can't talk anywhere else, but in the UK, digital literacy isn't part of the curriculum. It's very much teacher-led to whether a school includes it as part of a lesson plan. Of course, lessons and curriculum have a lot of different, factors involved, so it's hard to decide, what should be included. But at least today, it's not something that is part of the UK curriculum. I do think things will change, we'll say, because of course, COVID, our world has changed significantly. So I do think things will change. But these skill sets that, that can help us, be aware of how to spot false information, fake news, are something that is not part of at least the UK curriculum. So I think that's an important topic, at least in my view, is thinking about if we're trying to prevent these rhetorics kind of emerging, it's starting in need with young people who we know already have these beliefs.
On that note of optimism, to bring it back to something, Maria, you said that really scared me, is the idea that that the disinformation purveyors are evolving their tactics, that they're turning to influencers, that they're keeping up with the way we communicate to try to stay one step ahead of our digital literacy and our ability to spot the frauds. What have you seen in terms of what are sort of the other new ways that disinformation people are reaching us? What are the tactics you've seen to combat disinformation? And do you have any sort of hope in our kind of collective ability to
yeah, no, I think that, the studies that we've done, that they're, you study it, you learn it, and then you basically throw it on the head. One of the things, for example, that we learned with the COVID vaccination campaign that we did was that people didn't trust doctors. They were the least performers. That's a problem, but so we didn't use them. The other thing that we learned was that you answer their insecurities, but you don't reestablish their insecurities, if that makes sense, right? So if they hear that the vaccines takes you out of a job for weeks, all you have to say is like, I didn't miss my job. I didn't miss a day of work, right? So you just have to be smart with language. But I also think that the elephant in the room is we have to figure out, how do we start holding platforms accountable? We have platforms, sadly, that through disinformation and misinformation and racial, it perpetuates racial tensions, where we've had in Myanmar, we've actually had genocide happen to ethnic groups because it was spread disproportionately on Facebook. What responsibility is there to stop that? We talk oftentimes in the work that we do that stuff that is right now being flagged on Facebook in English and stopped is not stopped for Spanish-dominated Latinos in America. We should have the same rules. And this idea that you can't find enough interpreters, there's 60 million of us. So you got to be kidding me, right? So I think it's really recognizing that, yes, Daniel's point, we actually had a conversation with members of the Senate because they asked what can they do. And one of our recommendations was doing digital literacy from a very young age and teaching people how to navigate and giving that. But giving the onus fully on the public education and the private education system leaves about the fact, something that Dean was referring to, is the multi-billion-dollar companies that are making money off of this, and they're trying to say regulate us, but they don't really offer solutions. And so they have to be part of the conversation, because otherwise, absent that, we are going to do a whack-a-mole. So right now they don't do the translations in Spanish, but what happens when we realize that they're not doing it in Hindi, or where they're not doing it right? So it's setting up a set of rules, but also recognizing that there needs to be a form of repercussion. I think the challenge is that we're just in a new day, in a new era, that there's not enough experts in the field that can actually help write the rules, because oftentimes they are living and writing the rules right now within these corporations. If that makes sense.
I'd like to just add here, thank you so much, Maria. That's really very interesting. I wonder if we don't also need a kind of a non-internet set of new channels of communication. If you look back 50 years, we had ways in which different social classes and regions and races got together. We had a compulsory military, right. And that was a way that one emotional world channel of information got to know another in a daily kind of way. We had an active labor movement. That was another kind of organic way. And labor movements they were the middleman between the working class and the Democratic Party, not there anymore. So we need open, new structural channels. And I think of one model for this. When I was down in Louisiana last time, there was a young man who wanted to start something called, he has now, the American, what's it called? The American Exchange Project, that now is in 22 states. It's for high school students. And okay, they get to know each other on Google Chat. They get friends. And then they arrange to visit each other. You get the South to go north for 3 weeks as the guest to some other high school student that, has been now your friend. And you get the coast to go inland, the inland to go coastal. So it's a kind of a high school level structure where you get some instruction about how to be with each other. And actually, last I heard, after the third storm hit Lake Charles, Louisiana, a bunch of the northern kids wanted to come down and help rebuild the town. They're not the same politics, and they're not in the same, informational world. So that's another way, opening a new kind of face-to-face communicative channel.
No, and I think that's right. I also think that we need to figure out also almost cross-border collaborations as well. I will flag that the surge of the border that first came when the Biden administration came was because folks in El Salvador were receiving messages that the border was now open. It's one of the reasons why the Haitians left Chile and Brazil and are flooding the border, because disinformation is being used to disrupt our systems but they're often caught in these, countries of origin. So if there's a way for us to collaborate, then we can actually stop and alleviate that. But I do think that you're right, is what I'm hearing you say, and I think that's the essence, is that as a country, we've become much more insulated and isolated. And this idea of, if you look at where the populations boomed in the country, they're all in the South. Well, what's wild is that what you're talking to, there are no labor unions in the South. It never took hold. So there's no sense for workers to come together. When you see the reason why you see a rise in the evangelical church in more rural communities, it's disproportionately Latino, but it's because there's nothing else there, and most people are leaving the church. So what you're saying, it reminds me of Robert Putnam's Rolling Alone, right? But we're 25 years out of his, and this is basically what's happening, is people still wanting that connection, but being used to other people's ends because they don't know their neighbor.
Very well said.
And the question of solutions and accountability is such an important one. I think one that we don't discuss enough because these problems are so new and we're still trying to understand them. Dean, Maria mentioned the role the platforms, play in perpetuating misinformation. And I'm wondering, as we kind of move forward in the internet age, what your thoughts are in terms of what should the internet look like in the future? How should digital communication look like in the future if we wanted to not be so conducive to disinformation and misinformation?
Sure. Well, I mean, the problem there, unfortunately, the outlook is rather dire. So a lot of people like to point at the specific actions taken by Facebook or Twitter or whatever other social media platform you want to talk about. But it's important that we consider and look at the fundamental structure of the market in which they operate. So again, we're in an attention economy. So content that is sticky, that attracts a lot of attention, that's where the money comes from, right? That's what raises the advertising prices. And that's why Facebook is $1 billion company, right? That's why Twitter is $1 billion company. And so when you consider the basics of human psychology, right, Daniel's telling us all about this, that the best mis and disinformation is very sticky. It attracts substantial amounts of attention. There have been reports that have shown that the top most shared content on Facebook, in many cases, is disinformation or misinformation of nature. Basically, you have some really horrible looking incentives that not just Facebook and Twitter and the rest of the ones we know about have to deal with, but that any market entrant would also have to deal with. These are fundamental aspects of the market in which these social media firms operate. So even if you're talking about, okay, well, let's break up Facebook, or let's sanction Twitter or whatever, the next company to come in is going to be faced with those exact same market incentives. And so I think that what is necessary is not just punitive measures that are taken against specific companies, but fundamental restructuring of the way the market works to disincentivize mis and disinformation. I'm not a policy person, so I can't give specific prescriptions on that. In many ways, in the United States, where our hands are tied because of the First Amendment, right? So in other words, if you look at the U.S. government's answer to mis and disinformation, it's primarily demand side solutions, right? It's media literacy. It's let's understand the problem. Let's replace bad information with let's consume rather good information instead of bad, because the First Amendment limits our ability to engage with the supply side. It's not true in other countries, in Europe and other places. We don't have that issue, but here in the United States, we do. So the policy solutions that we have are somewhat limited compared to other countries. But it is only a policy solution that restructures the market for this kind of content in fundamental ways that's really going to address the magnitude of the problems that we face, because it's much broader than any single company, and any other company that comes into this market is going to face the exact same issues. And the next big social media firm, regardless of what it is, we saw this with TikTok as well, is going to, in the absence of market reform, face the exact same incentives and have the exact same problems.
The attention economy that Dean mentioned, Daniel. One thing I think about a lot is I have friends that will tell me how they find themselves having more and more trouble reading books or anything long because they find their attention span has been cut down so much by the internet, just by being online. I'm curious, have you seen any evidence or put any thought to the notion of whether the internet has actually changed how we think, how our brains work? And if so, how does that contribute to how we can combat misinformation? And if not, like, is it merely that this is just kind of our brains haven't changed, but just the platform is different?
So I'm not sure exactly that the question about internet changing how we think. Maybe others know the answer to that particularly, but my kind of response to it is conspiracy narratives have been around since arguably the start of time. They've been around way before the internet. And that's because, at least for me, it goes back to that human psychology of the biases we have, the needs that we need to have addressed, understanding the complex world that we've always lived in. So in a way, if the internet didn't exist today, we would still be talking about conspiracy theories, because of course, theories have been very popular before the invention of the internet. Indeed, that's why when I was reflecting, when I listened to everyone who was talking about new platforms and whatnot, is actually trying to deal with some of the root causes of conspiracy theories and indeed falling for misinformation. By that, obviously, I mentioned myself about digital literacy and working with platforms, and I think that's a really good point. But of course, if we're not dealing with the root cause, whilst we're giving people the skill sets to evaluate information, they're still going to look at that information with their rosy glasses in a way. They're going to stay arguably in their echo chambers, whether that's in real life with the friends that they have, or indeed in the social world that they belong in. So I think actually I wonder if it's best to try and think about ways to practically deal with some of the reasons why people are drawn to conspiracy narratives, as in across time in general. So impairment, uncertainty, anxiety. And some interesting thoughts have been around, well, okay, we can do that in the lab. So it's been shown that in experiments that if you make someone feel more empowered, more in control, they're less likely to want to believe in conspiracy theories and also engage in fake news. So that's great. That actually works in the lab. But of course, you know, that is just in the lab. It is just behind closed doors. So how could we actually use that in society? So there's been some ideas which I think are quite interesting around procedural justice, which in essence is about giving voice to those in our society. Is where people who feel that decisions are fair are actually shown to have reduced belief in conspiracy theories. So it's encouraging transparency with decisions. It's ensuring people have a voice when it comes to decisions in our society. So potentially having some of the fundamentals around procedural justice could be one way to make someone feel more empowered, which therefore could be an antidote to belief in conspiracies, and alongside kind of teaching people about how to navigate the online world in collaboration with the social tech companies. So I thought I'd mention that in there, because I think in a way, when you kind of deal with all these things at once, and of course, back to my point earlier, is it's hard, it's complicated. And, you know, I try to be optimistic about these things and how we can deal with all these issues, but it's human psychology by itself is complex, never mind adding in the complex world of the internet and social media companies and all that.
You know, can I just say that Daniel's really given us a paradigm for how those on the left and center should think about conspiracy. Whereas I think there's what's happening is a lot of people on the left are shaming the conspirators, you know, and shaming has a big backfire effect that I don't think people are aware of. I
fully agree. And of course, in a way, you're othering those people and you're making them feel more ostracized, socially excluded, alienated, which would only actually put fire under their beliefs and kind of further them down the rabbit hole. So that's why I think for me, it's really important to humanize. And, you know, even just a few years ago, there was always a stereotype that, you know, people are paranoid wearing tinfoil hats, which of course just paints them out to be othered, which of course, you know, is not the case. Anyone in the right situation could find conspiracy theories quite appealing. That's so right. Yeah, it's important to humanize in my mind.
Well, and one way the way I've communicated is, imagine if you know, when you were a teenage kid and your mom said no and didn't believe, you know, how you had a spat. The more that you realize that your mother was right, the least likely you would admit it to her, right? So you're just like. So if we recognize that's where we are, so that instead of people recoiling, it's just trying to figure out how, just how do you bring them along, but without judgment, because that's the hard part. That requires sometimes bigger spirits, given some of the things coming out of the conspiracy world. So.
It's an interesting notion, what you said, Daniel, about tying the issue of fairness to being acceptable to conspiracy, right? Where if you want solutions because you're in the midst of problems, and so you're looking around, whereas those who have the luxury to not deal with those sort of problems, perhaps it would not be as urgent to look for those sort of solutions. I know we're about to run up on the Q&A in a few minutes, but first I just kind of wanted to go around and see if each of you guys have anything else, and you don't have to if you don't have anything to add, but if you guys have anything else you want to add to the conversation. So let's just go in a circle. Dean, you first.
Goodness. Yeah, I think it's really important to think about mis and disinformation not as permanent characteristics of any particular claim or piece of content, but as relationships between people and the content that they consume, generate, and circulate. So what I mean by that is something that is disinformation for somebody who knows it's false and is trying to harm someone can be misinformation for somebody else who believes it. In fact, those two work in a symbiotic relationship, right? So if everybody thinks it's disinformation, then it doesn't work because, that kind of gives the game away. But the sort of disinformation, people are spreading it among people who believe it, for them it's misinformation. And that gets it to much, much wider audiences because there's not enough money to go around to put everybody on the disinformation payroll, as it were. So I think it's just really important that people think about it in that way, rather than thinking about those as sort of permanent characteristics of particular claims and pieces of content.
Harlan?
I just say that I think the punchline should be, that this kind of bridge building between groups as these bridges become less available as they disappear is really a huge, big deal, urgent matter. And everything that I think has been said in this panel just would only add to it. This isn't an ornamental add-on to the discussion of the day. I think we're faced with a crisis, and this is part of averting that crisis.
Daniel?
So I would add, I think we've done a good job, in my view, of humanizing those who believe in conspiracies. So I want to kind of underline the dangers of those beliefs. And of course, millions of people endorse these rhetorics, and we've actually seen it play out, just this year with regards to COVID, anti-vaccine, with regards to violent reactions. But of course, it can also be having conspiracy theories about minority groups. So we see an increase in prejudice towards a range of age groups and also discrimination. And also really interestingly as well, I found in my work that prejudice can also move to different groups who are not involved in the conspiracy, something we call assurity generalization. So in a way, conspiracy theories stop us acting in a positive way, i.e. around vaccination, even to do with voting as well, but also can also interfere with intergroup relations, both with increasing the negativity, but also in violent responses. So whilst conspiracy theories for some people are a rational process, they can have some real world consequences that are particularly worrisome. That's why interventions are particularly timely. And I particularly enjoyed the conversations we've had around interventions, where I'm excited to see the next steps in the next few years to see how we develop those ideas.
Maria?
Yeah, and I think that is right. I think the biggest danger right now is that there are real harm that comes when they leave the chat rooms and hit the streets. And the most extreme has been what we saw, sadly, in January 6th. That was the most extreme. But there are measures to curb it, because if you all recall, or maybe you didn't know, just 2 weeks ago, there was another Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C. But because we didn't have the person with the largest bully pulpit on Twitter organizing folks, no one really came. And so it's really recognizing that there are perpetrators of it, and what are is banning one method of it. That's one. The other, though, is how do you safeguard the communities they hurt? I'll share with you, in a conversation I had with Facebook right after 2016, we knew that that there had been Russian operatives who had set up fake meetings, fake events, under the auspices of Black Lives Matter, under the auspices of anti-immigrant groups, under the auspices of pro-immigrant groups. And we knew that where this was happening, there must be some sort of relief valve. And we were asking, where did these take place? And they wouldn't share it with us. Well, the challenge with that is then there are communities right now that are in pain, that are scared, that can't address these anti-immigrant, anti-Black issues. And if we at least don't have the same information, then we can't actually go into communities, as Arlie said, and start healing. And so we have to, again, figure out how do we do that. And it has to be, it can't just be academically, and it can't just be nonprofits. It has to be it is getting so dangerous, to Arlie's point, that there has to be both government and corporate interventions. And it has to be a way that there are penalties and repercussions, because lives are at stake. And we've already seen the harm of what has happened.
Great. We've got some wonderful questions from the audience coming in. Dina, I know you have to head out in a few minutes, so I want to toss the first one your way. You mentioned this idea of the economics of this and the incentives to promote disinformation. Are there any ways to inoculate both ourselves and our loved ones against bad information?
Yeah, I think that the question of inoculating people against bad information is fundamentally one of value, right? And of values. So I come back to what Daniel was talking about in terms of educating people when they're young, right? So the values that we hold as adults are inculcated in us when we're young. So creating a value of following the truth wherever it leads, educating people about concepts like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, understanding the negative consequences that ensue from belief in misinformation and disinformation, using historical examples, and really just saying, and the other thing too is I think we should also, to spread values of constructive and public changing of minds. This is something that we don't see in our culture very often. People, it's sort of perceived as bad or weak to change your mind. I remember, back in the days when it was considered an insult to call a politician a flip-flopper, right? So someone who changes their minds according to the political winds, or just for whatever reason. But changing minds is a very important thing to do when you're confronted with new evidence. Or when something is revealed to be mis or disinformation. And if you can't do that, you leave yourself in a very, very vulnerable and perilous position. So I think that it's really a question of values. I think schools are a great place to do it. I think parents can teach their children. Because I do think that, as Daniel said, like once you get past that sort of middle adolescent stage, it becomes very, very hard. People's opinions harden, their political beliefs harden. It becomes very, very difficult as folks get older to change it at that point. So I think really operating on people when they're young is the way to do that. Although that does, I think we talked about some of the ways to change people's minds when they're older, but I think we've also recognized the difficulty in doing so.
Great. Maria, a lot of the distrust that folks have for institutions, particularly folks from marginalized communities, very reasonable, right? We come from media institutions that have long been largely just white male, same with government institutions, and a government that has oppressed many groups of people in many different ways. So for people who have very, very valid reasons to distrust institutions, whether it's media or government, how can we get those people to build trust in institutions that have every right to its trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I often say that, during the Trump years, everybody kept saying resist, and I kept saying no, occupy. It's like, resist is the wrong one. What we want to do is we want to occupy the voting booth. We want to occupy the chambers of Congress. We want to occupy the executive suites and media. That is how we change things, right? And I have to say that we are in an incredibly trying time right now in our country, but the amount of change and mind changing that has occurred just, I will say, in the last 5 years around more diversity inclusion, around Black Lives Matter, around the importance of just treatment of individuals, that has been cataclysmic. I mean, it has been an opportunity to see that people can change their minds and that they do need to change their behavior and their way of doing business. And I do think that that authenticity and that change, while painful, because I think we're going through a very, painful moment in American history, it also shows that this is a result of people actively pushing the system and saying that this is no longer tenable. Not having equity and justice is no longer tenable for a sustainable democratic country. And that is good. And what we need is to sustain that, to make sure that we're creating those changes. And that is the challenge, because I could say that having, 6 years of microaggressions and real aggressions under administration for whole swaths of communities, people are tired. And that was before a pandemic where people of color were disproportionately, hit under this pandemic, both economically but emotionally, and also lost loved ones. We have roughly about 120 children now that are orphans, and they're disproportionately brown children, right? So there's a lot there, but I also think that we do have a generational shift and a mind shift that is occurring in a positive direction, and we just have to continue being at it because the light is there. And what we saw was, people overwhelmingly coming in and having that one last trust of government by voting in a pandemic. And we all of a sudden see a government that is more attuned to the needs of us, whether it's the child tax credit that is elevating close to, over 50% of American children out of poverty. Well, because you gave the government another shot, right? So it's more of how can we continue being present, because there are nefarious actors who want you to tune out. And by tuning out, your lot does not get better, but someone is making money. So my whole thing is like, you better make yourself about politics, because politics is all about you.
And a quick clarification question. Someone in the audience is wondering, you mentioned a group who was most likely not to trust government or get a vaccine. Which group was that? What was the demographic group you had mentioned?
Those were, in our study that we did, it was both, the number one group was white, rural, non-college educated men. Yeah. And the second group behind it was the totality of the Latino community. I don't know what that tells you. Well, it tells you a lot. I think that after the Trump years, the Latino community was decimated emotionally and financially, and very much very hurt. And so coming back and trying to trust government was real. And that has nothing to do with the years of government with a G really causing a lot of pain. Most recently, we hear of the sterilization that occurred in the 1970s among Latinos, but no one talks about the sterilization that just happened in Georgia in detentions among young women, right? So the government is still very much in our business, and trying to heal that is not easy.
That clarification pivots to a question for Arlie, which is, how do we reach these white rural men?
Yeah. Well, first, don't shame them, by saying, oh, you stupid people, you don't get my message. They feel, in other words, we have to avoid backfire from exactly the messages Maria rightly points we need to get across, but how do we do it? I can just say that after January 6th, they felt, oh, the FBI has its notices out. These are my friends that they're going to come and jail, and so they're rounding up the great patriots. So they feel like victims. We need to listen for how they hear and talk to them, their symbol system. And if we get Maria's message out through their symbolic language, they feel a lot could happen. They are not mean people, but their notion gets in the way of actuating it. So messaging is really important, and face-to-face interactions with an absorbent self. I would say that all of us on both sides of this big divide need to know how to do what I would call some emotional labor, which is to turn yourself into an absorbent being and not feel like it's subtracting from you. In other words, take your alarm system off, actually grok what you're hearing. You'll be appalled by it, but you detach yourself, and get it and learn from it. What it's reconnaissance work, you could say. It's learning how they hear, what their language is, and speaking to them in their language with their symbolic figures. And there are people that they take as credible communicators. Get in touch with them, and who are the non-racist kind of Tea Party people that they think that's who they are. We think of that as a contradiction in terms. Well, there are some people that don't think that, and who think of themselves as potential bridge builders, but they feel very put down by the left and very cancel culture. One guy told me, he said, "Oh, I'm a fake racist." I said, "What do you mean fake racist?" "Well, you could mistake me for the old time racist because I hate the left so much." We got to listen to that. So what do you hate about it? Open that conversation. So both of us, both on their side and ours, we need to learn how to hear. It's not that easy when you feel what you're hearing is assaultive and it goes against every ideal bone in your body. But it's actually a skill, and anybody can learn it. And I think we need to.
That transitions well to a question for Daniel, and we touched on this a bit over the course of our conversation, but I think it's important enough to drill into now. On an individual level, people who have been caught up by anti-COVID conspiracy theories, people who want to help loved ones caught up in this, what would you tell them? What are the specific tactics they can use to intervene?
So it's echoing what we've been said so far. It's avoiding ridicule and not going into the conversation with the idea to win the conversation, but rather you're going in as a trusted messenger where you want to engage in a conversation around some shared values. Could be based on critical thinking, as I mentioned, but it's kind of a safe space between the two of you. If you go in to list all the reasons why their theory is inaccurate or wrong and why you're right, that's obviously going to get their defenses up, because of course they're going to be motivated to defend their beliefs. It is their beliefs which are going to be a strong part of their identity. So it's engaging in that kind of real positive discussion. Now, I want to say all that, but of course it's hard to have a conversation with someone who maybe you love, who is saying things that you just do not agree with. It will be a very challenging conversation. So for me, it's thinking about things more slowly, that you have this conversation over a period of time. A bit like you mentioned earlier, you're working out why that person holds those beliefs over 7 weeks, for example. It's not an easy process. And something else that I've been thinking about, which I have no data for, so please bear with me. But of course, we know that people have strong social identities. They feel part of a community. And of course, people may have felt ostracized, alienated. So this is actually a little positive part to their identity. So could somehow we try and shift their social groups, change who they associate with? So, for example, quite a mundane example is if someone's really into fitness and to running, maybe you as a family member start highlighting how that identity is really positive and encourage them to join a run club, for example, get involved with the community. Could that then make them feel more empowered and indeed not as alienated, which then make the process of reevaluating their beliefs a bit more easier? Now, of course, to say I have no data for that, I don't know if that would work or how it would work, but for me, I think social identity is so important, and how maybe giving someone more of a positive identity, such as joining a run club, could be one way to help. But again, just the idea that I've had.
And that sort of goes into this question. This was targeted to me, but I'm interested in hearing everyone's thoughts on this and how we avoid othering people, QAnoners, anti-vaxxers, other people with extremist views. And I think one thing I've learned just from my reporting process is that, I mean, as a journalist, it's easy not to other people because it's your job to sort of hear that perspective. And I think that's kind of one lesson I take from that professional necessity that I try to bring into my own personal life with my mom or other people who I disagree with, is trying to understand that we are all in many ways products of our circumstance. Yeah. That whether you grow up to be a a serial killer, or you grow up to be a racist, or you grow up to be an abuser of some kind, we don't have to excuse people's behavior in order to realize that they're products of their circumstances. That doesn't victimize them. That doesn't mean it's okay. But I think it's to understand why they believe the things they believe, at least, and that's sort of a pathway to empathy. Arlie, can you add on your own thoughts?
Yeah, great. I so agree with what you just said, just to underline that. And you know what I'd like to add to the conversation is that we need to look to the best practice folks in cross bridge persuasion. I'll give you an example of one man. His name was General Russell Honore. It's in Louisiana. He's the guy who rescued the victims of Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, become a big environmentalist. And I watched once when he was talking to a bunch of petrochemical managers and owners, and were very against any kind of regulation. Sort of freedom was their big symbol. Freedom from onerous regulations, freedom from big old government, and freedom. And anti-environment, they're all white, he's black. And I thought, how's he going to do this? And here's what happened. He got up and he said, I was looking out at Lake Charles this morning, and I saw a man in a boat, and he had his fishing line out, and he had his bucket ready. But that man was not free to lift out an uncontaminated fish that he could eat. I saw postures shift. I relax and open mouths. I saw an openness. What had he done? He took their symbol of freedom and he just moved it over to a topic they cared about. They loved their great fishermen. So that seems to me a best practice kind of persuader. He's not putting anybody down, no blaming, shaming. He's just appealing to them in a language he can hear. So we need to look at who are the real masters of this thing, just around the country. Put them in a room and all study under them.
Maria, anything to add to that? I think you're muted.
Are you talking to me?
No, Maria.
Sorry, my children just came in from school, so I muted so you wouldn't hear all of it, but they're fun to listen to. I think that it's going to take time, but I think that the challenge is the conversation is very much directed around how do we bring people from the other, back, but the others, are we also providing holding spaces for the people who are targeted? Because they are oftentimes the most marginalized and disenfranchised and may not be saying out loud what they're experiencing. And that is a lot of trauma. I'll share with you that one of the things, and I do think that it is conversations. I did a show a long time ago with, on MSNBC. It was the first it was the first English language programming that targeted Latinos in English. And we brought in someone that was a dreamer. He was DACA. He was undocumented. He was starting his own business. And we put him on stage with a really notorious ICE agent who, when he got on TV, would say some awful things. And it was interesting in the moment of the dialogue, by asking the right questions, at the end, we were able to get the ICE agent saying, I'm sorry, I just have to do my job. But no, because I asked him, I said, would you deport him? And he's like, no, I would not deport him. It was that humanity all of a sudden, because I think that he had never had that conversation. And so it is, how do we suit up for those conversations? Because they're not easy, but how do we meet people where they are? And how do we do it in a way that can show grace in really difficult circumstances, recognizing that some people are under assault all the time, and that this is where we need our allies, where we need our white allies in particular to really suit up and have those conversations, because they are far less at risk than, I would say, a 3-year-old in a classroom. And I use that as examples because when Trump went to rallies, there was a New York Times piece where a high schooler went in to disrupt one of these Trump rallies because it was very anti-immigrant. And she was so hurt to find that her teacher was among the crowd chanting that. Right. And so these are real people, real cases. And we're talking about giving so much breadth to people who already have platforms and already are understood, who are sadly preying upon people that are marginalized and don't have voice.
Great. Well, with that note, our time is up. Thank you to everyone on our panel, Arlie, Maria, Daniel, Dean. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. Hope you guys took interesting insights from that. Onward. That's all for today. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week and stay good, stay solid.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Stay well. Bye-bye.